This session will be moderated by Dr. Lee Jong-min from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me thank the Asan Institute and Chae Gong and Dr. M.J. Chung and their new chairman of the Board of Trustees, former Foreign Minister Yoon Young-kwan. I think if you look at the overall panel, this is the most important one.
Yeah,
Really?
No, it's true.
Okay.
It's true. I only tell the truth. It's the most important one because I'm chairing it. But number two, because it really is a salient subject. Now, all our panelists, I've known all of my friends for far too long, which tells me that I've been in this business far too long. Now, because we have 6 speakers, and they're all really intelligent people, I will force them to speak really shortly. And I know that you have all prepared remarks. Those prepared remarks are now in the trash can. And I will go down the line first, and I'm going to ask each and every one of you, beginning with Ambassador An, whom I've known for 30 years, ever since he was a young Foreign Service officer. So my question to all of you is the same. We know that there are key flashpoints in this region. So Ambassador An, what are you most worried about and why? You have 3 minutes.
Of course, North Korea. And then I would say only 2 things, which is that the first point is deterrence. And then with respect to deterrence, I think there is growing consensus in Seoul as in Washington, D.C., that something must be done. And the next question would be, what would be the benchmark? And then appropriate benchmark, which is emerging, again, both in Seoul and Washington, D.C. I think there is something called NATO-style nuclear planning group. Okay. It first attracted the attention of Korean public back in February 2020, in my mind. And then since then, it in fact has been growing in the level of attraction it in fact was getting from both in Seoul as in Washington, D.C. I think we're on the right track so far as the extended deterrence is concerned. My second point is diplomacy. Well, for the time being, North Korea is not responding at all. But at the same time, we must keep on knocking the door of North Korea because deep in my mind, I believe there would be something called Gorbachev moment arriving sometime in Pyongyang soon. And then look at North Korean economy. Look at the level of discontent which is growing in North Korea these days and how Pyongyang is responding to that. It is responding by further strengthening its power in the central government, which is making those problems worse, not better. I mean, economy gets going into deeper pit, and then the level of discontent, it is going up all the time. And that, in fact, is the reason why I'm pretty sure down the road we will have that Gorbachev moment in Pyongyang. So we will have to work for that.
Are you telling me that Kim Jong-un is Gorbachev?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm talking about that's the role I hope he would be playing.
I see, okay. I'll get back to you.
Right.
Professor Ken Calder is one of America's most prominent Asia watchers. He heads the Reichauer Center at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. I have to say this because he's an old friend of mine. So Ken, as someone who really knows Japan, China, Korea, etc., what keeps you awake? What keeps you up at night?
You know, in the long run, I think there's the existential threats that Jim Steinberg began talking about earlier. You know, obviously, nuclear is one, and that shadow, of course, hangs over the Korean Peninsula. So these existential threats certainly relate to Korea. There are others, of course, relating to Taiwan and so on. The others that, you know, the pandemics, the climate, those things, but even finance, I think we have to, you know, in today's New York Times, there was a piece that Hillary Clinton did on the implications of the debt ceiling, including the geopolitical implications for Russia and China and so on. So to maybe be a little on the short term, again, my concerns really center in Northeast Asia, Obviously, we talk a lot about the Taiwan-related contingencies, but the interactive relationships relating to contingencies in Korea, involving not simply Korea and the United States, but also relating to Japan as well, because there's a good possibility the North could, first of all, strike Japan. We're in an era of tremendously rapid communications and, of course, missile technology and so on, and our command and control, has it really developed in a way that we can coordinate in terms of intent. And you've also got the recent Japanese counterstrike capabilities that are emerging. So have we developed the capabilities to coordinate these super weapons and so on that are developing? I think we're not in the 1950s anymore. We need new forms of coordination on that complex relationship of Korea, Japan, and the United States, I think.
Gordon Flake is CEO of the Perth U.S.-Australia Center in Perth, Australia. He is an American citizen as well as Australian, but you don't speak Australian English yet.
Not yet.
So my question to you is why? No, seriously, Don, from an Australian perspective and also an American one, my same question to the other panelists. What are you most concerned about that's going to become the next major crisis in this region?
Well, thank you. I do have a heavy Arizona accent that I think I'm not going to lose, no matter how long I'm in Australia. But my perspective on these issues really is Australian. And when you look at flashpoints in this region, in the Indo-Pacific, there's several which I'm sure the other panels will talk about. We've already talked about the Korean Peninsula. We'll talk about Taiwan cross straits. We'll talk about South China Seas. We'll probably end up talking about the India-China border. But looking at it from an Australian perspective, I could bring in the South Pacific. There's an awful lot happening there right now, a real area of contestation that has echoes that would go all the way back to similar strategies of denial in World War II. I'm in Perth. I'm in Australia's Indian Ocean capital. I could look out at the Indian Ocean, a real area of contestation that's really important to energy flows, et cetera. But I thought what I would do, and the things that I'm really more focused on given where I sit, is focus on resource flows and supply chains. Because if we look in history, you just have to go back to World War II and many, many other areas. It's not the typical hot flashpoint where military on military conflict starts. But if you're talking about a flashpoint as something that might lead to a conflict, the risk to global supply chains, and particularly the risk to global supply chains in critical materials, rare earth elements, in future energy materials, is something that I think that warrants a lot more attention. Today, China commands between 60 and 70% of global rare earth mining and about 85 to 90% of rare earth processing for rare earth elements. And again, you've got 12 of them in every cell phone you carry or more. Major weapon systems, be they submarines or jet fighters or missiles, all require copious amounts of critical materials. And at this point, we're as a U.S. as a country, as an AUKUS alliance between the U.S. and the U.K. and that, we're reliant on China for those components. Also, I was at a meeting in Sydney about a month ago. Our Minister for the Environment gave a really prescient comment. He said, there are many things in the world that can slow Australia's transition to a green economy. There's only one thing that could stop it: market concentration. And what he means by that is today about 80% of all lithium processing takes place in one country, in China. Now, we get some false sense of security out of the U.S. because the U.S. has stockpiles of rare earth elements. My understanding is those stockpiles would last about 90 days. We have further stockpiles, but those stockpiles are dirt. Yeah? The U.S. does not have a sovereign rare earth processing capability. In fact, there is only one commercial scale rare earth processing facility outside of China. That is Lynas. It's a West Australian company that was invested in by the Japanese after the 2010 rare earth scare, and it's in Malaysia, being operated today, but under constant threat. So there's talk about the U.S. doing something in Texas with Linus and others, but we're years away from that. So to me, this is one of those things where if you look at the supply chain disruptions that we saw during a relatively mild, by conflict standards, something like COVID, and you start putting that in the context of a conflict, our global economy shuts down. Korea's economy shuts down. And the U.S. economy shuts down because it's so deeply intertwined. So yeah, supply chains, particularly supply chains related to future energy, to future batteries, to critical materials and the rare earth elements in every front, that to me is a flashpoint in waiting.
But you haven't told us what the trigger will be, and I'll come back to you. So Bonnie Glaser is one of the most prominent China-Taiwan watchers. I say this because she just invited me to a conference in Lithuania, which she chaired, and I spoke at on NATO and the Indo-Pacific. But seriously, Bonnie has been watching China and Taiwan more closely almost than any other scholar that I know. And she is now head of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. So Bonnie, given the fact that we both just came back from Lithuania, is there any correlation between the Ukrainian war and what's happening in Europe and what could contribute to another flashpoint in this region?
I personally don't think that there's really very good analogies to be drawn between Taiwan and Ukraine.
Okay.
It has been a useful wake-up call, I think, for people in Taiwan and for the international community. And in that regard, I think it's helpful to say, yes, of course, a war that we didn't expect would happen could happen, and we need to prepare for it. But that said, there are many factors that are different between Ukraine and Taiwan.
Sure.
The Taiwan situation is fairly unique. But we should worry about Taiwan for many reasons, but I think it is the most likely potential trigger of a U.S.-China war in the region that could escalate very quickly. I think there's many reasons to be concerned that that potential war is growing. We see concern not just in the United States, but many places. Just to cite a few reasons, the shifting military balance in China's favor, the fact that Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027, the fact that Hu Jintao's strategy of pursuing peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait has essentially failed, and China knows that. And today, only about 6% of people in Taiwan support reunification, either now or at some undetermined time in the future. China follows those polls very, very closely. And another factor is that Beijing is losing confidence in the U.S. one-China policy. There are probably other factors, but I think those are the main ones. But I'm glad to hear that there are more and more officials and military officers in the United States that are saying war is neither imminent nor inevitable. And it's important, I think, to have clearer and more consistent strategic communications on this issue, because throwing around various deadlines and suggesting that this war is inevitable, I think, doesn't serve our interests. And when I met with Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's president, at the end of last year, she said that it was very important that we shape Xi Jinping's cost-benefit analysis and continue to take actions to raise his perceived assessment of the costs of using force against Taiwan. And I think that Xi Jinping knows what many of those costs are. The PLA could lose, and a failure by the military to take over Taiwan could end up undermining Xi Jinping's position and potentially the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. It could set back Xi Jinping's priority goal of achieving national rejuvenation by the middle of the century. So I think those two reasons are very important. And I think that the Ukraine war has, in fact, induced greater caution. Xi Jinping has seen that a military that is battle-hardened and has tremendous advantage in their conventional weapons, has not been able to easily take over Ukraine. So I think, again, the Ukraine war is relevant in his own sense and estimate of whether he should attack Taiwan. So I think that if we use this strategy of raising costs, that we can avoid war. And the last thing that I'd like to say is that China really needs to understand that all countries have a stake in the preservation of peace and stability. And there are so many ways for countries to signal that they have that stake. And it will vary from country to country because every country has a different comfort level in what they're willing to do. And we have seen in Korea, even in the last administration, where there was a joint statement with the United States that Korea and the United States share a stake in preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And of course, President Yoon has already and very recently reaffirmed that position. And we've seen in the G7 also a statement. But going beyond rhetorical statements, there is the possibility of countries doing more, taking more forward-leaning actions, such as sailing through the Taiwan Strait and demonstrating the freedom of navigation. When leaders meet with Xi Jinping, it is extremely important to actually convey to Xi Jinping that countries don't want to see the use of force against Taiwan. And then finally, I think there's a need to signal now a willingness on the part of leading democracies to impose sanctions should China actually use force against Taiwan. That was something we didn't do in the case of Ukraine. Thank you.
Ankit Panda is a colleague of mine from the Carnegie Endowment. All he thinks about is North Korea's nuclear weapons. No, seriously, he is one of the most preeminent experts on the North Korean nuclear issue. He's written a great book on this issue. He's really well versed on military and intelligence issues. So, Ankit, from where you sit, and the fact that you are looking at various conflict scenarios, what are you most concerned about? Are we reaching a tipping point moment with North Korea's nuclear capabilities?
Thanks, Jungmin. And let me echo my co-panelists on thanking the Asan Institute for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. Yeah, I think your prompt to force me to rethink my prepared remarks. I had a little bit of the advantage here while others spoke to think about this. I think in the short term, what really does keep me up at night is that I see a lot of objective evidence that North Korea is, like many other states in the past, thinking quite carefully about what its nuclear weapons are good for in terms of short of deterrence objectives, right? So in the near term, the possibility of North Korea employing its nuclear weapons for coercive ends is something that I think deserves real scrutiny. We've seen this in the past with other states that have acquired nuclear weapons. The United States did this in the 1950s. The Pakistanis tried this with the Indians shortly after detonating their nuclear devices in 1998. North Korea has been an interesting outlier so far under Kim Jong-un, really since the twin crises in 2010 and arguably the August 2015 landmine incident. North Korea has not directly tried to leverage its nuclear weapons for limited territorial revisionism or other kinds of kinetic action against South Korea. Now, Chung-min, if I might, I also would note that we need to, of course, recognize that the geopolitical context in which Kim Jong-un is operating has changed quite a bit since 2019, when I think Kim Jong-un went through the first iteration of studying what his nuclear weapons were good for and engaging the United States in an unprecedented process of diplomacy. And the reason I bring up the changing geopolitical context is something I do want to bring up, and this has been mentioned earlier at the plenum today, is the possible of simultaneous crises or horizontal escalation, so to speak, emerging in the Indo-Pacific, where a limited U.S.-China crisis, stemming from, let's say, a mid-air collision between a PLA Air Force aircraft and an American aircraft that spirals into a crisis that might absorb American attention, might give Kim Jong-un reason to opportunistically attempt new types of coercive action against South Korea. Let me close by saying this, right? We all, I think, intuitively understand the importance of deterrence in this new uncertain security environment in Northeast Asia. The art of deterrence is quite simple when it comes to deterring an adversary from nuclear use. Communicate to the adversary as credibly as possible that should they resort to nuclear use, the costs that they will face will outweigh any benefits. And we might impose those costs via punishment, or we might deny those benefits by making sure that our own military capabilities are sufficiently robust. But there is a second leg to any strategy of deterrence that the United States discovered not too early into the Cold War, but by the 1960s. This was an important part of how at least the United States and the Soviet Union came to think about deterrence, which is assurance. Just as we communicate to adversaries that they will suffer costs if they take action adverse to our interests, so too do our adversaries need to be reassured that should they continue to exercise restraint in the course of a crisis and not resort to nuclear use, or not resort to even indicating that they might resort to nuclear use, that costs will not be brought down upon them. And I think this has been an interesting part of how the United States has actually messaged to Vladimir Putin around the use of nuclear weapons, given the overt and covert nuclear threats that have been issued in the course of the Ukraine war, I would argue, to limited effect in a coercive manner against NATO and Ukraine. So yeah, that's kind of what keeps me up in the short run, but more broadly speaking, when I look at the Indo-Pacific, the salience of nuclear weapons around this region, from the US-China relationship to the Korean Peninsula, to the role of nuclear weapons in US extended deterrence relationships, things are changing quite quickly, and I think it's long past time that the Indo-Pacific give nuclear weapons a serious rethink in the role that they play in this part of the world.
Thank you. Last but not least, on the first round, General Walter Sharp is a former commander of U.S. forces here in Korea, and the only person on the panel who actually has prepared for war. Thank God war didn't break out under your watch. And I'm sure that, I hope it won't break out anytime in the near future here on the Korean Peninsula. But General, based on your experience on looking at all the for scenarios, the Korean People's Army's, I guess, war doctrine, strategy, growing PLA A2AD capabilities, are you concerned that something might go belly up here in Korea?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity. What keeps me up as you start about what I think the flashpoints are that I worry most about with North Korea is not only their growing capability on the nuclear side, but we also can never forget their conventional capability with over 6,000 artillery pieces, 4,000 of which that could hit this building without moving. Their growing cyber capability, the largest special operating forces in the world. It's very, very strong capability. So how do you deter that, and how do you prepare for that capability? And it's not only the intentional capability. What I do truly worry about is an accident. Something happening. I'm still amazed with all the rockets that North Korea has fired, that one of them has not gone astray and landed in Japan or South Korea or someplace else, because escalation, especially in today's environment where people aren't talking to each other, don't have good mechanisms to talk to each other, escalation can come very, very quickly. And I know South Korea, and I know that if some mistake or some attack in South Korea happened, the response going back into North Korea is going to be very, very rapid and very, very strong, and that makes escalation very, very hard to control. So how do you deal with all of this to be able to hopefully not get to that point to deter it, but if it does happen, that you're prepared to defeat any sort of actions by North Korea? And I'll try to very briefly talk about two items that I think are very important. Number one is, of course, the strength of the military, the strength of the alliance, the strength of the coalition here. But the other one, I think, is a much more deep discussion about what are acceptable end states. Not only from our perspective, but probably most importantly, what is an acceptable end state from the North Koreans' perspective? So to the first one, how do you prepare? How do you make sure that you can be as strong as you can? We're doing a lot of those right now. South Korean military is an outstanding military. An outstanding military. Defense spending is going up. They're buying the right sorts of things. It's a very, very professional military. United Nations Command. I think United Nations Command is a key component in both deterrence and response. 18 nations currently in United Nations Command that on a day-to-day basis prove that their countries are here and are prepared to deal with what North Korea could throw at that. I think strengthening that alliance, strengthening that command through more exercises, bringing more countries in, getting it firmed up even more so within the plans, again, is not only deterrent. North Korea sees this. He sees what happened in Ukraine with NATO. He sees, I mean, United Nations Command is obviously not the same as NATO, doesn't have all the same agreements. But the fact that they are here and continue to be here and to be able to work to say we are ready to respond, I think is very, very important. Combined Forces Command, the only command in the world, as far as I know, that is truly a combined command. The strength of that command, where it's not supported, it is one command, U.S. and the Republic of Korea sitting side by side, not only doing exercises together, but doing plans together, all of that, continuing to strengthen that, keeping that combined as we can go into the future. And I can talk more about that later as to OPCON transition and all if desired. But the key component of it is that it truly is combined. And then lastly, that I'll mention in the deterrence and preparedness ability is trilateral cooperation, and more than just cooperation. I'm very encouraged about what's going on now between South Korea, the Republic of South Korea, Japan, and the United States, but making it more than just ISR and exchanges of intelligence. Truly doing exercises together, understanding plans together, and planning together. Because I truly do believe that if anything happens to this region, it's not going to be two parts. It's going to be at least a regional conflict that I think will spread even further beyond that very, very quickly. And how do you strengthen that in all elements? Not, we've talked a lot about extended deterrence being the nuclear side, which I think is, again, important, but all of the capabilities to include conventional planning and working together. So that's the deterrence side and the preparedness side. Then briefly, how do you talk, how do you get to the point where you don't have to get to that? It doesn't get to that in the future. I'm a firm believer that
General, can I interrupt you for a second? And then can you save that for the next round?
Yes.
Right, okay. Ambassador An, recently the Chinese Foreign Ministry lambasted the Korean government for what President Yoon said about Ukraine. And then President Putin also directly criticized or threatened South Korea that if you guys give lethal aid to Ukraine, well, what might happen with Russian assistance to North Korea? We are living in an era when China and Russia are no longer a distant problem for the South Koreans. This is really becoming where, basically the rubber is meeting the road. As someone who has worked in the Korean Foreign Ministry all your life, how do we cope with Chinese and Russian pressure going forward?
So Ambassador Lee, you are in fact giving me the most difficult question for this.
Well, but you have 2 minutes to answer this. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as a matter of fact, I wonder if 2 minutes would be sufficient,
Yeah.
Because that question, in fact, touches upon the most important foreign policy and security issue for Korea. So I think there are at least 3 points that we should be thinking about. The first point would be this, which is that, what should be Korea's basic relationship with the four powers? Four powers meaning United States, Japan, China, and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have no other option than to cooperate with all four of them because of geopolitical reality and because of geoeconomic reality. So we will have to cooperate with them. So there's
but if they continue to impose pressures on us economically, let's say Moscow sends, advanced jet fighters to North Korea.
Lee, as a matter of fact, let us forget about the pressure for the time being. I'm talking about the basic position that Korea should be adopting, right?
Right.
Second point would be this, which is that, when you say we must cooperate with all four of them, it doesn't mean that all four of them are equally important for Korea. Of course, it must be based upon Korea-US alliance relationship. So if there is any conflict, then of course there is something we'll have to think about it. That is to say, all four powers' relationship with the all four powers are important, but at the same time, it must be based upon Korea-US alliance for many of the reasons I don't have to go into. Third point would be this, which is that does it mean that Korea has to cooperate with all four of them? Does it mean we, in fact, have to acquiesce with everything they do, with everything they say? And my answer would be no. And when it comes to the United States, then in the past 1 year, then of course there have been many delicate issues between Korea and United States, like IRA. What should be done about the IRA? The way it is implemented. What about Chips and Science Act? What should be done about it? And I think we made a good progress by engaging United States in all those discussions. What about the relationship with Japan? Then of course, all those issues with history, then of course we have to stand firm on issues of history while at the same time developing close relationship on other issues. I think same principle must apply to our relationship with Russia, to our relationship with China. So what in fact, in essence, was what President Yoon said? What he said was that, well, even if you are in a war in Ukraine, it doesn't give you a mandate for you to massacre civilian population. Even if you are in a war in Ukraine, it means that even in the situation of war, there is certain humanitarian wartime international law that must be complied with. That's what President Yoon said. And then when it comes to Taiwan Straits, then what they said was that, well, if you want to change the status quo, you mustn't do it through the use of armed forces.
Well, I doubt
And then-
highly,
and then-
however, that Moscow and Beijing will listen to President Yoon.
Well, Ambassador Lee, I have to remind you, Korea is not alone. When we say them, then just listen to what France says, what UK says, what Germany says, what Japan says, what
So
Australia
your
says.
strategy is let's
then- and
basically arm up with our friends, right?
Well,
Thank you. No, I'll come back to you. Ken, recently, President Yoon has spent a lot of political capital normalizing relations with Japan.
Yes.
That took a lot of guts. He's gotten terrible press for this. His poll rating is like 25, 6%, maybe, I don't know, Now,
about 30%.
above 30%? Okay, well, so it's good that Japanese-Korean ties are improving, but in a major crisis involving China or Taiwan or North Korea, how do you foresee the Korean-Japanese relationship? Will it be strong regardless of who's in power in Seoul?
I think that it certainly takes a lot of work. There's no question about it. As one sees the evolution, say, of the last decade or so, again, I'm not a Korea specialist, but I get the impression that things have become maybe more polarized between the two main parties than was previously the case. Well, it's true enough under President Kim Dae-jung, there was some reconciliation, but the progressives, increasingly perhaps, critical of Japan using the Japan-related issues, not that there isn't a basis. And I say that as a Japan specialist, certainly there's basis. But at the same time, it's made handling the polarization, I think, has made things more difficult. Transcending that to I think the role of the United States, certainly both Democratic and Republican administrations have tried their best to promote trilateral cooperative projects. And I think in many areas, certainly there is a logic of that if we're talking about energy, which is a common concern for both Korea and Japan. Both of them import very heavily from the Middle East. Both want to develop alternatives to hydrocarbons and so on. I think joint projects, including things that are trilateral or overseas development assistance. There are some countries that strategically, both Korea and Japan also have deep interests in, of course, competitive economic interests, but trying to find those areas where cooperation does make some sense. we've talked earlier today, I think the fact that in 2002, the two countries were able to cooperate on the World Cup. Of course, I saw some of the games in Korea, but I was in Yokohama for the finals, and I can remember vividly that there was tremendous regard for the way Korea went to the semifinals and so on. And there were a lot of fans of Korea's performance over in Japan as well. So I think sports is one. Overseas development assistance, cultural exchange. This is a terribly important, and then again, the United States supporting these things. My own mentor, Edwin Reischauer, was one of the founders of the Korea Institute at Harvard, even though he was a Japan specialist. I think we have to think of ways that, because it's so important from a strategic point of view, in the kind of world that we're moving into, with all the technical innovations, means we've really
Ken,
got to
ultimately,
focus.
though, political forces in Tokyo and Seoul are going to play a very important role.
Yeah, very important.
To the extent that they will cooperate, right? And I'll come back to you. Gordon, Australia has done AUKUS. The Japanese are now going to develop the 6G fighter with the Italians and the Brits, right? So what should Korea do to basically offset looming crises? Should we do our own kind of AUKUS, or is there something new to what you see in AUKUS?
Well, first and foremost, I should applaud Korea for returning to its rightful role in the region and globally. Korea is, depending on how you count it, the 10th, 11th, or 12th largest economy in the world. Yeah. And through a good chunk of the last 5 years, Korea was absent. And I say this with a heavily Australian perspective. When you talk about things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when you talk about things like the South Pacific or the Indian Ocean, we had long come to expect from Korea this kind of global Korea, Korea is a kind of a leader in all these forms. And for a period of time, Korea became solely focused on the peninsula and the peninsula itself. And I'm someone who believes that the peninsula benefits tremendously from an international coalition. And so if you're looking at Korea's immediate risk, obviously those are tied up in close cooperation with Combined Forces Command, the United States, but it's in leveraging Korea's international stature in relationships with countries as far-flung as India and Australia and Europe, and of course, improving with its near neighbor of Japan. All those things put Korea in a far better position technologically, in terms diplomatically, in terms of cooperation, and I would say militarily in terms of security. I don't know that there's immediate appetite for an expansion of AUKUS. If there was, the immediate first cab off the rank would be Japan. Japan has obviously openly called for a JAUKUS kind of agreement. And I think what we're going to see is AUKUS plus. We're going to see, the submarine deal itself is going to be really, really hard, even with 3 countries who are all members of Five Eyes, who have this deep linguistic, cultural, legal, and technological background. It's still going to be a really heavy lift. But that doesn't mean the second pillar of AUKUS, which probably hasn't got enough attention here in Korea, which is much more about technology development. It's an industrial cooperation. It really highlights some of the things that's come out during the course of today. The fact that we, not just in Australia, but in the US and the UK, have kind of allowed our industrial capacity to atrophy. And for us to compete in this next era, no one country is going to be able to do it alone. And so the more we kind of leverage AUKUS-like agreements, the better it's going to be for Korea, for the region at large. And I think you'll find pretty open arms from the other countries in this region.
Just quickly, Gordon, I want you to act American for 2 seconds. Why is the U.S. giving nuclear power technology to the Aussies, but not to South Korea?
Obviously, that's a sensitive issue here in Seoul, because I know there has been long-standing desire for that technology here in Korea.
Don't speak like a diplomat. Tell me what the real
well,
reason
again,
is.
and I know full well that the U.S. response was always, we share that technology with no one, right? I actually don't think this is as much about Korea as it is about Australia. It speaks to the tremendous strides that Australia has made over the last 20 and 30 years to integrate the U.S. And Australian security sector, intelligence sector, et cetera. So I spent 25 years looking at Korea and Japan through the prism of two Northeast Asian allies, and I thought I understood Five Eyes before I moved to Australia. I thought it was just language and culture and history. I didn't realize what a deep legal underpinning there was for the U.S.-Australia relationship, where they jointly collect, interpret, and action intelligence, to a level that, to be honest, exceeds combined forces commands and many other things. And that has just led to this level of intimacy, that there was a level of comfort in that process. But also, I would also say, in the last 5 years, when these decisions and discussions were being made, Korea was very inward-looking and only focused on the Korean Peninsula. And you can't say that the U.S. hadn't been supportive on that front. Australia was the classic canary in the coal mine, at the coalface, facing some fundamental challenges in the region. And if you have an Indo-Pacific strategy, you can't have one without Australia. And so it was reinforcing that core fulcrum point of the Indo-Pacific.
You haven't
and
really
US
answered my
capabilities.
question, but that's okay. I'll leave it.
Fair enough.
I'll leave it for the next round. Bonnie, you mentioned the importance of signaling, right, over Taiwan. Over the last several years, American admirals, the director of the CIA, other high-level officials have set on record that there might be a conflict within the next 5 years or so, right? They've given a particular timetable. Why are they doing that? Is that to basically signal to Xi Jinping that you should not do this because there will be heavy consequences? Does signaling like that actually help the situation? Having watched Taiwan or watching Taiwan so closely as you have, and you have also unprecedented access to officials in Taiwan. So what is that what is their thinking in Taipei?
Well, I've already answered part of it, but I'm happy to elaborate. I myself think that the strategic communications has been confused. 2027 was first introduced really by Admiral Phil Davidson when he was the commander at Indo-PACOM. I think in part this was in testimony to Congress. I do think it was driven by a desire to get more resources, but there's nothing wrong with that. If you're sitting as the command at Indo-PACOM and your mission is potentially to defend Taiwan in a crisis, you need to have more capabilities. But I think that was really the trigger of this discussion about 2027. But as I said earlier, there is some evidence that our intelligence community has reached a shared conclusion that Xi Jinping has instructed its military to be ready. Now, Xi Jinping is always telling his military that they need to do more serious exercises, they need to get prepared. Why is he saying this? Because he doesn't believe that his military is ready. And so that's an important factor.
Do you believe the PLA is not ready?
I believe today that the PLA is itself, when it in its own writing says it is not ready to take Taiwan. So the level of confidence is not high enough. There are certainly disputes about whether or not China could use civilian rather than military transport capability to move hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Taiwan. So it depends what exact capabilities you're looking at. But I think that the most important thing is that Xi Jinping and the PLA itself does not believe that it is ready to take Taiwan. So I think that strategic communications matter. We have had some individuals in the U.S. government and the military say there could be an invasion by 2025, 2027, 2024. We have to be ready today, right? I mean, an invasion could happen anytime. I would also note that our Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific has said that he doesn't believe that we're going to see an invasion or major use of force before 2030. But I think there's a shared view that this is a dangerous decade, in part because China sees itself as having some conventional advantages that perhaps a decade hence it may not have. as the U.S. introduces new technologies, new weapon systems, to be able to counter China's anti-access area denial capabilities. And so there is this worry that the Chinese will act at some point because they will fear that they will lose what advantages they may see themselves having today.
But Bonnie, don't you also think that part of that is to reassure, to let our allies and friends know that the U.S. is there? I mean, we went through the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we went through President Trump saying some things, and to be able to reinforce is, no, we are going to be around the world trying to work hard for security and stability, and for countries, like-minded countries, we're ready to be able to help stop that type of thing. Isn't that part of some of this messaging that's also going?
I think most of the messaging the administration is doing that is deliberate, is actually aimed at our alliances and to some extent our domestic audience. Less of it is actually aimed at China and at Taiwan.
That's right.
So it's about investing in America and aligning, strengthening our alliances, and then using those two pillars in order to more effectively compete with China. So I think a lot of it is intending to reassure. Right. I'm not convinced that it's really having that effect.
Ankit, you've written a lot about a new arms race in the region. If you look at almost all of the major armies in the region, whether it's China, the two Koreas, Japan, and so forth, they're all investing heavily on hypersonics, new ISR assets. The Chinese are working overtime to make sure that they're able to destroy American aircraft carriers at minimum cost. So this trend is going to continue, right? How worried are you that this type of hypersonic, new technology-driven arms race could really result in a major crisis?
Thanks. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the region, the Indo-Pacific, is broadly in the throes of a security dilemma, right? Defined as countries perceive their adversaries to be taking actions to improve their own self-defense capabilities, and in response, they have to take action to augment their own defense for purposes of deterrence. Largely speaking, I think that's true across the region. We've already heard about Australia's Defense Strategic Update, AUKUS, Japan's new National Defense Strategy, and of course, successive ROC governments' longstanding efforts to augment conventional deterrence, Taiwan's growing investments in its own asymmetric capabilities, and of course, China and North Korea, where there is no shortage of quantitative growth. So that, I think, is the baseline that I want to set. And then, Chuck, when you asked about hypersonics specifically and some advanced technologies, I think it's important to sort of recognize that the arms racing dynamics we're seeing do have a certain novel qualitative aspect to them, right? So hypersonic capabilities, there's an AUKUS hypersonic research and development capability that actually long predates the Defense Industrial Partnership. Australia and the United States have had civilian research on hypersonic flight platforms going back to the early 2010s. The potential for these capabilities to, I think, impact escalation in a crisis, I think, is something that deserves serious attention. We hear very frequently in Seoul about the very short flight times of ballistic missiles on the Korean Peninsula, and that's absolutely true. It's true of old-fashioned ballistic missiles, including North Korea's Hwasong-5s, based on Scud missiles that date almost back to the 1950s, and it's true of hypersonic weapons that are being introduced in the region today. So I think I'd also agree and foot stomp the point that Skip raised about the difficulty of managing escalation in this high-tech environment where escalation can take place at paces that can simply outclass the ability of human commanders, military planners, decision makers to truly understand the environment. Now, what is the prescription here? I've admired the problem. Now let me try to offer a pathway ahead. And of course, this is going to sound rather, I think, optimistic, but we've dealt with these problems in the past. We've dealt with arms races, albeit not a messy multipolar arms race like we're seeing in Asia. And the answer is traditionally found in measures of negotiated restraint. I don't want to use the word arms control because I think that implies certain things that I don't necessarily want to imply. But this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, needs to begin talking about these regional dynamics, about the possibility of unwanted wars. right? We can broadly think of arms control traditionally or risk reduction as solving the problem of wars that aren't wanted by any parties in the region. Now, as we learned in Ukraine, wanted wars are a different problem that can't necessarily be solved by that same toolkit. But my hope, and I'm working on some ideas that will hopefully have some relevance in this regard, is that the region can begin moving in this direction, and that meaningful means of at least transparency can begin to take hold in this region. Although with China and North Korea traditionally being strongly opposed to these transparency measures, it's going to be a very long, I think, walk to get there.
Okay, thank you. General, quickly, UNC rear in any major contingency on the Korean Peninsula is going to be critical. The Koreans are always worried that in a major crisis involving Taiwan, for example, some assets in the U.S. Forces Korea, including the 7th Air Force, might be redeployed out of the peninsula. So should we worry about that?
I think we have got enough sense to be able to look to see globally what is going on, both in Taiwan and other places that are around here. The ability of the United States goes far beyond 7th Air Force and the ability to be able to use those assets. So, is it a worry? I think it is a worry from the perspective of simultaneous conflict. I do worry about North Korea taking advantage of any sort of conflict in Taiwan and trying to influence that. That will be a real challenge to have a major conflict in two different areas of the Indo-Pacific. So it's not necessarily just U.S. forces going down there. It is how do you deal with two potential conflicts going on near simultaneously. So I do worry about it from that perspective.
I think I would like to bring the audience in because we only have 15 minutes left and I'm going to end on time. The rule is you have to be under 30 years old. No, I'm just kidding. But I do want the younger generation to speak. But there are a couple hands. Yes, sir. Please direct your question to a panelist and then make it very short.
My question goes to Ambassador Ahn. And then, as Ambassador Ahn surely knows, the Article 10 of the NPT clearly stipulated that the member countries can withdraw from the treaty in case their national interest is seriously jeopardized. Given the fact that North Korea has minimum 30, maximum 100 nuclear bomb, we can say that Korea's national security has been clearly jeopardized. So, given the fact that U.S. commitment to Korean Peninsula in the face of North Korean nuclear threat is not could be limited. So, I'd like to hear Ambassador's personal view on the South Korea's nuclear armament. Thank you.
Okay. I'll take a couple more questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hello, my name is Jacko Zwetsloot. I'm from NK News. My question is for General Sharp. There exists some concern in South Korea that there could be a repeat of November 2010 when North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island. At that time, you were commander here, and President Lee Myung-bak was keen to retaliate in an aggressively disproportionate way, but was dissuaded from doing so. How was that? How was President Lee dissuaded from doing so? And if the current president is a little bit more hot-headed, what could be done to dissuade him?
Actually, you're mistaken on that because
He was not.
President Lee Myung-bak decided not to retaliate with full military force. I don't know where you get your facts from, but that's not the real story.
I can add some more when
Yeah.
you get through the other
Please,
questions.
yeah. I'll take one more question, and then we'll ask the panelists. The young gentleman in the back. 저쪽 맨 끝에 저기 저 젊은 분이요. 안경 쓰신 분.
Yes, hello. I'm intern at Asan Institute, and I'm taking a baby step on understanding North Korea. And my question goes to Mr. Panda. Would North Korea really push that magic button on KJU's desk, as they have committed last year on their legislation on the North Korean nuclear policy, with those hostile rhetoric? But at the same time, they would probably know that they are going to be eliminated from the map due to the massive retaliation from the ROK-US alliance commitment. So what's your take on that? Thank you.
Ambassador An, I'm going to go to you first, but because I want to end on time, this will also be your final comment. So answer his question within like a minute and a half.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think Ambassador Kim's question is about my view on Korea developing nuclear weapons. And then, as a matter of fact, in my initial statement, what I said was that there is increasing view, both in Seoul and Washington, D.C., that extended deterrence must be strengthened. And then the next question that should be answered would be, what should be the benchmark? And then I think for the time being, the appropriate benchmark would be providing NATO-style nuclear planning group to Korea. But that, I think, would be for the time being. So depending upon the situation, depending upon our assessment of the challenge, then of course we could go a little bit further based upon that NATO-style nuclear planning group. For example, equipping, say, F-35s with DCAs, dual capability, and then letting Korean fighters go all the way down to Guam, for example, and let them, well, in fact,
Can you please
engage,
switch off your phone? Yeah.
and then engage in training with American fighter pilots for, in fact, utilizing that DCA capability as an example. But for the time being, I think nuclear option would not be the way to go.
Okay.
Thank you.
General Sharp?
So in 2010, the South Koreans really were not prepared to do a massive response, and they did not. Up until that point, I think the majority of South Korean people believed that North Korea would never directly attack. North Korea would never directly attack South Korea. There were some South Koreans even at the time that still believed that North Korea did not sink the Cheonan. But that changed. That day in November changed South Korea. Counter-provocation plans were drawn up. The people of South Korea clearly believe North Korea has the ability and the will, because they did it on that day, to kill South Korea, not just military, but kill South Korean civilians. And that made a huge difference. And I believe that that still is in effect today. And the plans that are in place, the exercises, the capabilities that are in place now to respond to any sort of North Korea attack like that again, any sort of kinetic attack, is going to be, as I said earlier, very, very rapid, very, very strong. You've heard 10-fold, 100-fold. It's going to be very, very powerful to do that. And I argue that that planning, that capability, that resolve that the South Koreans have right now has deterred North Korea, because there has not been, other than 2015, you could argue all day whether that was, what that is, but there's not been another kinetic attack on South Korea. So I think it's very, very important to do that. To the last point is, I think moving forward, one of the things that we really got to work with North Korea is how do you apply not only external pressures to try to get them to change, but how do you apply internal pressures? And I think in order to get internal pressures applied to Kim Jong-un, the people of North Korea, the common people, the military, the regime underneath Kim Jong-un, the local mayors all have to understand that a changed North Korea, there's a place in that for them. We're not going to disband the army. We're not going to take mayors out and move South Korean mayors in and all. What is the place for that? And then having kind of understood that from a South Korean perspective, a U.S. perspective, Japanese perspective, a Chinese perspective, and the North Korean people's perspective, then how do you work hard to get information into the people in the regime in North Korea so that internal pressure can start at the same time?
Thank you. Ankit?
Yeah, very briefly. So, look, the central aspect of how nuclear deterrence works, not just for North Korea, but for any country, is inherent in the idea of manipulating risk to the ends of deterring one's adversary. So for Kim Jong-un to have robust nuclear deterrence, he has to have South Korea and the United States believe that he would be willing to push the proverbial button under certain conditions. And he's been rather ambiguous about those conditions. That list of 5 conditions that North Korea included in that law that you cited are, in my interpretation, broad enough that Kim could justify using nuclear weapons on days that end with a Y. But to the second part of your question about why should we take or if I interpreted it correctly, why should we take his threats credibly if he knows certainly that resorting to nuclear weapons use would mean the end of his regime, which is currently the declaratory policy of our alliance? I don't think Kim necessarily has to believe that. I think, in particular, the development of ICBMs in 2017 and the ongoing quantitative growth in North Korea's nuclear force and the diversification of North Korea's nuclear force means that North Korea could use nuclear weapons in a limited way and have sufficient nuclear capability left over to continue to threaten Seoul, population centers in Japan and South Korea, and the US homeland. And in the scenario where North Korea has already employed nuclear weapons, having done terrible damage to South Korea potentially, the President of the Republic of Korea and the President of the United States would then have to make a fateful decision about whether they want to continue escalating, risking additional nuclear retaliation against their cities, because I frankly believe the possibility that we will successfully destroy the entirety of North Korea's nuclear strike capabilities preemptively is rather unlikely. And so that is the fundamental deterrence problem. It's why I believe that we in North Korea today do face a nuclear adversary that presents a very similar set of policy challenges as we've traditionally faced with countries like Russia and China, even at a much smaller case.
Yeah, thank you. Bonnie, if you could do one thing to prevent a major crisis in the region, what would it be?
I don't think I can control policy in China and Taiwan.
Okay.
Both of which I'm a bit concerned about. So I would then just have to say something about my own government.
Right.
I think that we must have the military capability to defend Taiwan, because that in itself will
We
affect,
as in the U.S. and
as
Taiwan.
in the United States. And it's important for our allies to play a role in peacetime. In a real contingency, I think there is probably expectation that Japan would be involved, but I doubt that there's expectation that our other allies would be extensively involved in any military operation. But if we have the capability to inflict tremendous costs on China, if we really have a capability to deny them the opportunity to take Taiwan, then I think that will ensure that deterrence holds. But until we have that, we have to rely on cost imposition measures.
Gordon, you said that the previous Korean government did not really do global. So what I worry about is that this government is committed to going global or more globalized. Assuming there is political change 4 years down the road and we go back to a much more inward-looking Korea, how does that impact our response to a regional crisis?
So I'm hopeful that there is enough of an environmental shift to outweigh kind of political pendulum shifts in South Korea. For a long time, people in Japan wondered, is this Japan or is this just Abe, right? But it now does seem that there is a broad consensus in Japan in terms of things they're doing which are quite historic. Leadership on trade, leadership on security in the region. That's because they have an existential threat. The same thing's true with India. All the things that we 10 years ago said India would never do, they're all doing right now. In fact, in many respects, they're more proactive. So I'm hoping that these broader recognition of the changed environment that's currently taking place in Korea will be more influential than that domestic, inward-looking political switch. Can I just say one thing, though, real quickly here? Coming up from Australia, I was aware, of course, of the robust debate about nuclear weapons here and the clause that allows Korea to withdraw from the NPT. And I do recognize that this Asan Plenum is a rather carefully curated group of perspectives. It's not representative writ large. But I think the discussion we've had all morning long about Korea's nuclear option is bizarre. It's in a bubble. It's a U.S. ROK bubble. If you did that, there would be consequences with countries like Australia, with Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Europe, with the rest of the world, and that hasn't come up at all. It's kind of like this, just as long as we discuss it together, it's going to be okay, Korea could go nuclear, and I find that to be a little bit out of context.
I disagree with you, but I'll save that for later on.
Fair enough.
Kent, You know, President Yoon has gotten a lot of flack for not getting all that much from his trip to Tokyo and meeting with Prime Minister Kishida. So what can our Japanese friends do to make sure that Korean-Japanese ties, particularly on security issues, remain robust and close?
Obviously, I think the quiet things that they can do to cooperate that benefits both sides, the intelligence sharing, the operational cooperation, certainly there's that. I do think, you know, reaching out, understanding historical context, not being perhaps, understanding historical context, understanding where Korea is coming from, I think is also important. And there's a lot of support in Japan for, you know, this kind of dialogue that's going back and forth. Japan took off the sanctions, those things are all being unwound. And I think that's all positive. There's a positive cycle here.
Ambassador Ron, in 1 minute, if you are President Yoon's special envoy to China, what will you tell President Xi Jinping?
Well, President Xi, if there is one thing he keeps on saying, there is the core national interest for China. And then I would be saying, well, it's okay that you think about your own core national interest, but at the same time, think about it, that other countries have their own core national interests. And then as a matter of fact, if I may, I could be citing what Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong said. I guess you were there as well at the Shangri-La dialogue that was back in 2019. What he said was that China, you just look around you and then think about if there is any one single country who are not looking upon your rise up as a power without a certain degree of anxiety in their mind. Why should they be? And then that I think would be a very serious question that President Xi would have to pose to himself.
We have 1 minute left, and I am so glad we're going to end on time. As I promised to you, I always end on time. And I end on time because our panelists were really able to say what they wanted to within the time limit. Let me thank each and every one of them. My last word is this: none of this will happen without the great staff at Asan. So those who work at Asan or are an intern, please raise your hand. Oh, come on, raise your hand. Yeah, okay. All right, let's give them a big applause. Thank you very much.